The sound of the glass jar shattering against the linoleum floor cut through the holiday. Music like a gunshot, and silenced the entire pasta aisle instantly. David froze with his hand hovering over the empty space on the shelf where the marina sauce had been just seconds ago while his youngest son stared down at the red puddle spreading over his worn sneakers. "I told you to stop running," David whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of 3 consecutive double shifts at the auto shop. He squeezed his eyes shut to block out the judgmental stares of the other shoppers because he knew exactly what they saw. They saw a man in a grease-stained Carhartt jacket who looked like he had not slept in a week and who clearly could not control his own brood of 5 wild children. "I am sorry," the boy whimpered, his lower lip trembling as he looked up at his father. David exhaled a breath that fogged in the cold air of the refrigerated section, and he knelt down to pick up the large shards of glass, ignoring the sharp pain as a splinter sliced into his thumb. "Please, just stand still," David said softly, wiping his bloody thumb on his jeans. At the end of the aisle, Jenny gripped the handle of her shopping basket until her knuckles turned as white as the snow piling up outside the sliding doors. She watched the chaotic scene unfold, not with annoyance, but with a hunger that hollowed out her chest. She saw the little boy crying and the frazzled father trying to corral for other children who were pulling items off the shelves, and she felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She looked down at her own basket, which contained a bottle of expensive Chardonnay and a single serving of organic lasagna. The standard dinner for a woman who had a large empty house and a successful career but no one to share it with. "Excuse me," a store clerk barked as he marched past Jenny toward the spill with a mop bucket rattling noisily. David stood up quickly and his face flushed a deep crimson as he fumbled for his wallet. "I will pay for it," David stammered, his rough hands shaking as he opened the leather bifold, only to reveal a terrifying emptiness where cash should have been. He remembered suddenly that he had used his last $20 to put gas in the van so the heater would work for the kids on the drive home. The clerk sighed loudly and rolled his eyes while David frantically swiped a debit card that he knew in his heart was going to be declined. The machine beeped a harsh rejection tone that echoed in David's ears. "I just get paid on Friday," David said, his voice dropping to a hum, trying to shield his children from the reality of their poverty. "Please, just take the items off," David said, pushing the carton of milk and the loaf of bread away from the scanner. His eldest daughter, a girl of about 10, with tangled blonde hair and a coat that was too small for her wrists, looked at the milk and then at her father with a quiet devastation that broke David into pieces right there in the checkout line. He felt the tears coming, hot and humiliating, and he turned his face away so his children would not see their protector crumbling. He was crying because the weight of 5 little lives was crushing his spine, and he was failing them over a $3 gallon of milk. Soothingly, a manicured hand with gold rings slid a black credit card into the machine before the clerk could cancel the transaction. "Keep the milk," a soft voice said. David spun around, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, and found himself looking up into the face of a stranger who looked like she belonged on a magazine cover rather than in a discount grocery store in Detroit. Jenny looked at him, her dark eyes swimming with unshed tears of her own, and she offered a small, trembling smile. "You do not have to do that," David said, his pride flaring up even as his relief washed over him. "I know," Jenny replied, her voice steady but thick with emotion. She looked past him at the 5 children who were now staring at her with wide, curious eyes, and for a moment, the ache in her wound was so strong she almost doubled over. "I'm not doing it for you," she whispered, looking at the little girl who was clutching the milk jug like a lifeline. David looked at Jenny, really looked at her, and he saw past the expensive coat and the perfect makeup to the shattered woman underneath who was looking at his chaotic, noisy, expensive burden as if it were the most precious treasure on earth. "Thank you," David managed to choke out, the fight draining out of his shoulders. "Let me help you to your car," Jenny said, grabbing 2 of the grocery bags before he could protest. They walked out into the biting Michigan winter, a strange procession of a wealthy woman, a struggling mechanic, and 5 children marching through the slush. As they reached David's rusted van, which had a coat hanger for an antenna and a patch of duct tape over the rear window, the reality of their disparate worlds collided. Jenny popped the trunk of her pristine white Range Rover to retrieve a reusable bag she had offered, and the interior light of her car illuminated a back seat that was pristine, spotless, and completely empty. David loaded the last of the bags into his van, the suspension groaning under the weight of the children climbing inside. He turned to Jenny, the snow catching in his beard, and he saw a single tear track cutting through her foundation. "Why are you crying?" he asked, the mechanic in him wanting to fix the leak. Jenny looked at the van, packed full of life and noise and struggle, and then back at her silent, empty luxury car. "Because you have everything I ever wanted," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. David looked at his van, then at her car, and let out a dry, humorless laugh that turned into a sob. "And you have everything I need to survive," he replied. The engine of the rusted van sputtered and coughed like a dying animal before finally roaring to life with a concerning rattle that vibrated through the steering wheel and into David's frozen palms. He glanced in the rearview mirror to see Jenny's white Range Rover idling behind him, her headlights cutting through the thick Michigan snowstorm like twin beams of judgment. "She insisted on following us," his eldest daughter Maya whispered, pulling her thin coat tighter around her little brother who was shivering despite the blast of lukewarm air coming from the vents. David wanted to tell her to go away because he did not want this beautiful, wealthy stranger to see where they lived. But the roads were icing over, and the tread on his tires was dangerously thin. He shifted into drive, and the convoy of two moved slowly onto the dark highway, the disparity between the vehicles serving as a rolling metaphor for the chasm between their lives. 20 minutes later, David pulled into the driveway of a small, siding-peeled bungalow that sat in the shadow of the old auto plant, the yard littered with bicycle parts and snow-covered tools. The moment David unlocked the front door, the chaos of his life spilled out to meet them. The smell of stale Cheerios and damp wool hit them instantly, and the living room looked as though a tornado had touched down specifically to scatter toys, laundry, and unpaid bills across every available surface. "Please excuse the mess," David said, rushing to clear a space on the sagging beige sofa by sweeping an armful of unfolded towels onto the floor. Jenny stepped across the threshold, her Italian leather boots clicking on the worn laminate flooring, and she did not look at the mess with the sneer of a social worker, but with the wide observation of an anthropologist entering a new world. The 5 children immediately dispersed into the chaos, the energy of the house spiking as they fought over the milk Jenny had bought. "It is fine," Jenny said softly, unbuttoning her coat to reveal a silk blouse that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. She watched as Maya, the 10-year-old, dragged a chair over to the counter to reach the cereal bowls, trying desperately to feed her siblings because she knew her father was too exhausted to function. David moved into the kitchen, his grease-stained hands shaking as he tried to help, but in his haste, he knocked a stack of mail off the counter, sending overdue notices sliding across the floor to stop at Jenny's feet. "Final notice!" The red letters screamed from the envelope. David scrambled to pick them up, his face burning with a shame so hot it felt like a sunburn. "I am sorry you have to see this," he muttered, stuffing the envelopes into a drawer that was already overflowing with similar warnings. "My babysitter quit this morning," he confessed, leaning heavily against the counter as the adrenaline of the grocery store faded, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. He rubbed his face with his hands, dragging the skin down until his eyes looked hollow and haunted. "If I do not find someone to watch them by tomorrow morning, I cannot go to the shop. And if I do not go to the shop, I lose the job. And if I lose the job," he did not finish the sentence because the conclusion was too terrifying to speak aloud in front of the children. Jenny looked at David, really seeing the precipice he was standing on, and then she looked at the youngest boy, who was currently trying to feed a toy dinosaur a spoonful of dry cereal. 4 years. Jenny had woken up in a silent house where the only sound was the hum of her refrigerator and the ticking of a clock that marked the passing of her fertile years. She had money, she had status, she had freedom, and she was so lonely she sometimes spoke to the television just to hear a voice answer back. Here, in this messy, loud, desperate house, she felt a pulse of life she had not felt in a decade. "What time is your shift?" Jenny asked, her voice cutting through the noise of the arguing children. David looked up, confused by the question. 7 in the morning, he replied. Jenny nodded, reached into her purse, and pulled out a sleek smartphone to check her calendar, though she already knew it was empty of anything that actually mattered. "I will be here at 6:45, she stated simply, snapping the phone case shut. David stared at her, blinking slowly as if she were speaking a foreign language. "What?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "I will watch them," Jenny said, looking around the room and mentally rearranging the furniture, visualizing where she would organize the toys, imagining herself cooking a hot breakfast in that cluttered kitchen. "You cannot be serious," David laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "You are a... ... Look at you." You do not belong here. I am not doing it for the money, Jenny said, taking a step closer to him, her perfume smelling like lavender and expensive vanilla, overpowering the scent of motor oil. I need noise, David, she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. I have a house with 5 bedrooms and not a single soul to sleep in them. And silence is loud, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. It is so loud it rings in my ears. David looked at this woman who had just paid for his food and was now offering to save his job, and he saw the cracks in her perfect porcelain armor. He saw that she was just as starving as his children were, only she was starving for something that could not be bought on a shelf. You do not know what you are getting into, David warned, gesturing to the wild scene behind him where 2 of the boys were now wrestling on the rug. They are monsters. Jenny smiled, and for the first time that night, it reached her eyes. I have always wanted monsters, she said. Over the next 3 weeks, the decaying bungalow underwent a metamorphosis that felt less like a cleaning spree and more like an exorcism of despair. Jenny arrived every morning at 6:45 sharp, her pristine Range Rover parked next to the rust bucket van, like a guardian lion. And the moment David left for the shop, she went to war against the chaos. She did not just fold laundry. She color-coded the socks and turned the mountain of mismatched clothes into neat stacks that smelled of lavender and order. She did not just cook dinner. She filled the house with the rich, heavy scents of rosemary roast chicken and homemade cornbread, smells that seeped into the drywall and pushed out the lingering odor of stale grease and anxiety. David would come home, his knuckles bleeding and his back aching from 12 hours under a lift, and he would stand on the porch for a full minute afraid to open the door because he feared he might wake up from this dream. When he finally turned the knob, he wasn't greeted by screaming or the crash of breaking glass, but by the sight of Maya doing her homework at a kitchen table that was actually visible beneath the clutter. One Tuesday evening, snow pelted the windows with a rhythmic tapping as the family sat down to eat a meal that had not come from a drive-through window. Jenny sat at the end of the table, her silk blouse now stained with tomato sauce, looking more exhausted than she ever had in her corporate office, yet her face held a glow that no spa treatment had ever achieved. She wiped the face of the youngest boy, Leo, with a tenderness that made David's chest tighten with a strange mixture of relief and guilt. I do not know how to pay you back, David said, breaking the comfortable silence as he pushed a forkful of mashed potatoes around his plate. I did the math, and even if I work overtime until next Christmas, I cannot afford what you are doing here. Jenny looked up, her eyes soft in the dim light of the kitchen. You are paying me, she replied, gesturing to the chaos of 5 children, chewing and laughing. For 10 years, my dinner table was silent, David, and tonight Leo told me a joke about a penguin, and Maya asked me for help with math, and I felt like I actually existed. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his rough, scarred fist. You gave me a life, she whispered. We are even. For a moment, the world felt perfect. A fragile bubble of happiness inflated against the harsh reality of their circumstances. David felt the tension that had lived in his shoulders for 5 years finally begin to dissolve, and he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had survived the worst of the winter. Then came the knock. It was not the friendly rap of a neighbor or the delivery of a package, but a sharp, authoritative pounding that demanded immediate attention. The laughter at the table died instantly. David stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, the old fear rushing back into his veins like ice water. He walked to the door, wiping his hands on his jeans, and exchanged a terrified glance with Jenny, who had instinctively moved to stand in front of the children like a shield. When David opened the door, the cold wind rushed in, bringing with it a woman in a stiff gray coat holding a clipboard and a police officer standing grimly behind. Mr. Henderson, the woman said, her voice devoid of any warmth. I am Cassandra Gable, from Child Protective Services. David felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. We've received a report regarding the sanitary conditions of this home and the supervision of the minors, she recited, stepping into the hallway without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes swept over the now clean room, but her expression remained hard, fixed on the file in her hand rather than the reality before her. We need to conduct an immediate assessment to determine if these children need to be placed in emergency protective custody tonight. But look at the place, David stammered, gesturing frantically to the clean floors and the warm food. It is fine. We are fine. "The reports we have are quite severe, Mr. Henderson," she said, ignoring his plea. "Malnutrition, unwashed clothing, hazardous environment." She looked at the police officer, who took a step forward, his hand resting near his belt. David looked at his children, who were now huddled together on the sofa, their eyes wide with the same terror he felt, and he knew that his past failures were finally catching up to destroy his future. He opened his mouth to beg, but no words came out, only a strangled gasp of despair. "Excuse me." A sharp voice cut through the tension like a razor blade. Jenny stepped forward, the transformation complete. She was no longer the soft, healing caregiver. She was the high-powered executive who negotiated million-dollar contracts for breakfast. And she was looking at the social worker with a fury that could burn down a city. She pulled her phone from her pocket and hit a speed dial number without breaking eye contact with the social worker. "I am calling my attorney," Jenny announced, her voice icy and commanding. "And then I am calling your supervisor. Because if you take one step toward those children without a court order signed by a judge I personally know, I will ensure you never work in this state again." The room fell silent, the air thick with the impending war between the power of the state and the power of a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. The silence in the room was heavy enough to crush lungs, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet sniffling of the youngest boy. "Leo." Cassandra Gable stared at Jenny, and for the first time since entering the house, the bureaucrat's mask of indifference slipped to reveal uncertainty. "You have no grounds," Jenny stated, her voice lowering to a register that vibrated with dangerous calm. She stepped aside, sweeping her arm across the room like a magician revealing a grand illusion, forcing the social worker to actually look at the environment she was threatening to dismantle. "Look at the pantry," Jenny challenged, pointing to the kitchen. "It is stocked with organic produce and enough food for a month. Look at the children," she continued, her finger moving to point at the 5 terrified faces on the sofa. "They are clean, they are clothed in new winter gear, and they have completed their homework." The police officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, his hand dropping away from his belt as he realized the situation was not the domestic disturbance he had been briefed on. Cassandra walked slowly into the kitchen, her eyes scanning for the filth mentioned in the report. But all she found were gleaming countertops and the lingering scent of rosemary chicken. She opened the fridge, expecting emptiness, and found rows of meal-prepped containers labeled with days of the week. "The report said there was no heat and no food," Cassandra muttered, closing the refrigerator door with a soft thud. "That was a month ago," David said, stepping forward to stand beside Jenny, realizing that he was no longer fighting this battle alone. "Things were hard," he admitted, his voice steadying, "but we fixed it." Jenny reached out and took David's hand, lacing her fingers through his rough ones in a show of solidarity that was both a performance for the state and a declaration of truth. "I am their primary caregiver," Jenny lied smoothly, though in her heart it felt more like a vow than a fabrication. "And if you remove these children from a safe, warm, and loving home based on outdated information, my attorney will have a lawsuit filed for emotional distress before you get back to your office." Cassandra looked at the united front of the wealthy woman and the mechanic, then at the officer who was already shaking his head, signaling he would not enforce a removal in these conditions. "We will keep the file open for 30 days, Cassandra said, her tone professional but defeated. She snapped her clipboard shut, the sound signaling the end of the siege. "If the conditions remain this high, we will close the case." The moment the door clicked shut, the air rushed back into the room. David's knees gave out, and he slid down the wall to the floor, burying his face in his hands as the adrenaline crashed. Jenny sat down beside him, heedless of her expensive trousers on the floor, and wrapped her arms around his shaking shoulders. "They are not taking them," she whispered into his ear. "I will never let them take them." The children, sensing the danger had passed, rushed forward, creating a pile of limbs and tears on the hallway floor, burying David and Jenny in a chaotic hug that sealed their bond forever. David looked at Jenny through his tears, realizing that she hadn't just bought them groceries, she had bought them a future. The smell of cinnamon rolls and brewing coffee filled the renovated kitchen of the blue bungalow. David stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with a dexterity that had returned along with his confidence, humming along to the holiday music playing from a high-end speaker on the counter. He wore a clean sweater, and while his hands were still rough from the shop, the shadows under his eyes had been replaced by laugh lines. "Daddy, look," Maya shouted, running into the kitchen holding a report card that boasted straight as, "That is amazing, sweetie," David said, scooping her up for a hug, but his eyes were fixed on the back door. The door opened, and Jenny walked in, shaking snow from her hair, carrying a box of decorations. She did not look like a visitor anymore. She looked like the foundation the house was built upon. She walked over to David, and he kissed her. A natural, easy movement that spoke of 12 months of shared breakfasts, shared worries, and shared joy. The 5 children swarmed around them, pulling at the box Jenny held, their laughter filling the space that had once been a tomb of silence. Jenny looked over David's shoulder at the chaotic, loud, messy happiness that surrounded them. She remembered the woman she was a year ago, standing in the grocery store aisle with a bottle of wine and a frozen lasagna, crying because her life was too perfect and too empty. She looked at the spilled flour on the counter and the pile of boots by the door, and she smiled. "Are you crying?" David asked, wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek. Jenny shook her head, pulling the youngest boy, Leo, into her arms. "No," she replied, holding her family close. "I am finally done crying."